Seems like we have a pretty good group already in the live chat, but if you're joining us later, I'm sure you'll be richly rewarded. Now, who's this avant-garde looking guy on the thumbnail for this particular talk? Well, that's Ezra Pound, and it might not be a name that you're familiar with unless you're an English major, and even then, it might be possible that your professors left him off the curriculum. And that's all the more reason for us to investigate. There's a reason why he's been sort of blocked out of the literary history. Nonetheless, there was a recent book, by recent I mean, let's see, 2017, I would count that as recent, a recent book by a British literary historian. I think that's a decent characterization. His name's Daniel Swift. He's a professor. What is his affiliation here? Let's see. The College of Humanities, London, or New College of Humanities, London, which I don't know much about, but anyway, he is British, and I think it's important because he's coming at Ezra Pound from a certain perspective that's predictably not going to be very flattering. Because Ezra Pound was one amongst the first modern, and by that I mean he was born way back in 1872, no, not 72. He was an Edwardian gentleman. He was born in the previous century, all right? He died in 1972. His look is very 2023, and I think a lot of younger poets, writers, people are interested in the beats, for example. For those people who were into the beat fad for a while, William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg and that whole crew, there was a big fad, I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago. I think it's a natural progression for you to go even earlier back and check out Ezra Pound, because, man, he was a beat before the beats were the beats. And he was very much for real. And in fact, the beat movement would not have been possible had it not been for Ezra Pound and people within his circle. People such as Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings, James Joyce. These are some of the more prominent figures. And they're lesser, I don't mean less important, but lesser names that we might not know. They were very much influenced by Ezra Pound. And then, of course, there were contemporary poets. I call them the academic poets because prior to, I think, the 1950s, it was very rare to see anybody teaching poetry specifically. And people like Charles Olson, which was news to me. He figures prominently in the life of Ezra Pound. Charles Olson, which I didn't know until reading this book. He's an academic poet. Most of these people wound up in academia, and of course their creativity was either stifled or died out entirely. People of this ilk, John Barron and the post-war poets, were very much influenced by Ezra Pound, which makes it all the more puzzling why he is not really taught anymore in the English department, except by maybe one allotted specialist. There's the Shakespeare guy or gal, there's the guy that does Dickens, and maybe there's a person that does modernist poetry, and Ezra Pound maybe specifically. And the reason for this, I believe, is not because of his poetry, not because of his aesthetics. He was a cultural critic. He wrote several books on American, not just elite, but Euro-American and European, particularly Southern European, since he lived in Italy for, I think, 20, 25 years, possibly 30 years. Most of his adult life he lived in Italy. And I mention that because this is what got him in trouble when the United States was lured into the Second World Bankers' War, World War II, as it was called, But the bankers' war, which he called out, I'm talking about Ezra Pound, called out and named who was who, and also tracing them back to their earlier war, World War One. And he was in his majority when World War One took place. A lot of his friends were killed. People like Hemingway, of course, famously were involved with on the battlefield with the Spanish-American War, reporting World War One. These were the writers of action, as opposed to the academic namby-pambies who did GLBTQ theory from the comfort of their air-conditioned nightmarish office. These were men who were fighting fascism, including Ezra Pound. And I say that counterintuitively because when you hear, if you've heard of Ezra Pound, you've been trained, it's a dog whistle effect. You've been trained to associate him with, fascism, Ezra Pound. And in fact, that happened to me when I was introduced to Ezra Pound in college. He was still alive when I was a freshman in college, but he was in his dying days. He died, like I said, in 72. But when I took the course in Asian religion, which was really big back then, it was post-60s and all things Asian and Buddhism and Zen. We're talking about Allen Ginsberg and all the pop Buddhists, and the whole pop culture started to move into the occult, Hinduism. This is when the Beatles went on their pilgrimage, and this is when paganism really started to undergo its contemporary revival. We're still in the midst of this, right? Ezra Pound didn't address the plague of paganism as such, but he did talk about Moloch, and he talked about the occultic origins of what he called usuria, or usury, right? And that's what got him in trouble, because, again, one of those dog whistle terms like Ezra Pound, fascism, usury. When you hear usury, you hear Jew, right? We've been conditioned to that. Even though as we know, the banking system was not created by Jews. They were kind of slotted into that position, that middleman position that allowed certain families, but the Rothschilds. And by the way, by calling out the Rothschilds, this was his death warrant, really. He wasn't killed. They were trying, the establishment were trying to indict him. Well, he was indicted for treason against the United States of America, but they weren't able to execute him. Such was his prominence, his cultural prominence, not just in America, but in Britain and English-speaking world, and throughout the world, really. He was an internationally prominent figure. So to put him into that bag would not only have been incorrect, but it would have been a really bad move on the part of the U.S. government. So they did the second best thing. They put him in the bug house, the nut house, the loony bin, for about 12 years or so. And it's St. Elizabeth's, no apostrophe, St. Elizabeth's. And from what I understand, it was founded by one of these spiritualist inflected do-gooders, Dorothea Dix. Remember, I've been talking, and I'm going to get back to this. In fact, I should clear this up before I even get into Ezra Pound. I should go back and tell you some follow-up discoveries. But Dorothea Dix is credited with founding a humane insane asylum. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, and it is. And I mention this is because Ezra Pound was really one of the first political dissidents who was subjected to psychiatry as a form of political discipline. Right? We know a little bit of what was going on in the Soviet Union in parallel. They used psychiatry as a way to silence political dissidents, but there was a parallel movement going on in the United States and certainly in Britain and other countries. France, I'm not so sure about that. There was a more of a humanistic streak that was retained. They didn't swallow whole hog the Freudian perspective and the institutional bedlam, right? Short for Bethlehem model of taking care of what Foucault later wrote about extensively about the crazy people in society, and many of them were crazy on as defined by their heterodox ideology, and he challenged the globalist banking establishment at the outset. And so another reason why I'm talking about Ezra Pound today is because, as you know, I've been trying to, because I didn't realize how the current generation of truth seekers, and I mean that in a positive term, even though it's used disparagingly sometimes, the current younger generation of truth seekers is oblivious to the forefathers and the foremothers of this line of inquiry. And it's important not just historically, but it's important because we're not. It prevents us from falling from the flak masters and mistresses that have been put out there. A whole new generation of flak meisters who are supported by wealthy mommies and daddies who bought them YouTube channels or publishing companies, who are not only plagiarizing Ezra Pound and his chief, most productive disciple, Eustace Mullins, who I'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to talk about Ezra Pound, and I'm going to talk about Eustace Mullins. He's another person who is rapidly fading from memory, even though he died not that long ago. I think I don't want to get the date wrong, but he certainly died by the time I was well into this field of what used to be called alternative research. Now it's called entertainment research, right? You've got all these different channels that present this rehashed, warmed over, denatured material as original, and it's mainly for distraction purposes. And even though they might be sincere, but it's mostly so to keep us in a state of fear, of chaos, of uncertainty, and of this social psychology of catastrophism, which I'm going to critique. It's become a social psychology in the United States and perhaps the world over, because people all over the planet now through the internet can watch, the Alex Jones show, or I just mention him because he's sort of like the umbrella term for the dozens, if not scores, of channels now that have captured the imagination of those who speak and understand English, right? And so I'm doing this talk for you to understand that this whole line of inquiry and entertainment has been hijacked, right? Just like social movements that start organically from the grassroots, right? Like the Green Movement, right? The environmental movement started from grassroots concern about what's happening to our farmlands and wetlands and whatnot. And hopefully by now, most of these so-called environmental groups, Greenpeace, all the way down the line, that's just one name out of many that comes to mind, have hijacked that movement. So wouldn't it make sense that, for those of you who don't want to believe me, wouldn't it make sense that this whole field of conspiratainment has similarly been hijacked and body snatched and swapped out with younger figures? And I'm not against youth. If you're for the truth, I don't care if you're youth. It's okay with me. It's fine. In fact, it's highly important that you get involved, but it's also important that you not be deceived by some of these people that you want to emulate, because all of a sudden they're rocking 500,000 subscribers out of nowhere. Excuse me for a moment. Privately printed guidebooks, sort of like Skull and Bones used to have an annual, and like I said, it was Charlotte Isserby who led the privately published yearbooks to our friend at the Hoover Institution, Anthony Sutton. This information came into the hands of people like Eustace Mullins, to the point where now these books are beginning to appear. This is another academic book published by the University of Edinburgh. You want to talk about New World Order? You want to talk about Old World Order? You want to talk about Knights Templar? You want to talk about Scottish, Anglo-American relationship, British-Scottish relationship? You want to talk about Scotland and the attempted overtaking of Hapon, or Japan, the Japans? Unfortunately, they ran into a superior civilization who were armed to the teeth and had 250 years of internecine war under their belt to repulse the Templars that came to take it over. And before them, the Jesuits, who tried to take them over ideologically. So we're talking about a global system here. And by the way, another reason why Ezra Pound was pounded on, especially in the post-war Cold War establishment, because he dared take China seriously as a civilization. In fact, as I told you before, my introduction to Ezra Pound was in a course on Asian religions. This was in 71, 72, around the time that he died, right? And one of the required readings was the Analects of Confucius. You know, and like you and me, I'm a third generation American, so I had to watch the same bullshit you did on the movies and the reruns and the Saturday show about Charlie Chan and about Confucius Say and about fortune cookie and about the Chi-Coms today. Right? I was socialized in that. I was socialized into that regime of mind control, to the point that I later wrote a book about Asian Americans on TV called Monitored Peril. I made it into my career. You understand? That's how you attack these problems. You don't just shake them off and hope they'll go away. You attack them. And these New World Order handlers were interested enough in what I had to say to hire me and take me into their bowels at the University of California, Davis, based on my scholarship that was challenging their regime. I guess their thought was, it's better to keep your enemies close to you. We'll just give him a little token job here as a token hop scene of the Bonanza Ponderosa Ranch, and he'll just shut up and do his little Chinaman, his Japanese houseboy, his Japanese gardener act for us. That's what they thought. I'm just trying to project what was going on, but they were wrong. And it's due to work, people like Eustace Mullins, who were telling the truth, that now the establishment themselves is coming forth with it. And I think, getting to this book proper, and that's one of the reasons why I think Daniel Swift came out with this book recently, is because no matter how they try to suppress Ezra Pound by locking up in the bug house, we know it is a nut house, right? For 12 years, 13 years, according to some accounts. And trying to defame Eustace Mullins, which I'll read extensively, a whole passage that Swift devotes to Mullins to try to defame him. And I'm going to do this in the attempt to encourage you, if you haven't already. Many of my viewers are already there, so I apologize if you already know this and you've seen all the videos that you can find on YouTube on Eustace Mullins in particular. And all his books are still available. They're usually in zip files, and they're on PDFs. I have some excerpts that I've shared with you on my Patreon. So he's not going to go away. So they decided to get a literary critic to see what he could do to eviscerate the memory of Ezra Pound, and the contribution, not just the memory, of Ezra Pound and Eustace Mullins. But anyway, I'm trying to, let me finish up with Apperson-Hearst and Lathrop, Stanford, the two crazy women's, right? The two major research institutions, and their origins in occultism, more specifically spiritualism or spiritism. One of the offshoots of that, or manifestations of that, is theosophy, which is alive and well, and that's why I've done the talks on Santa Barbara, and that's when I started getting put on the bench, getting strikes from two of you, especially when I talked about the reality show starring Harry and Meghan, right? And the Institute for Democratic Institutions, Santa Barbara, tied it in with the California. All right, there's a whole trajectory that Professor Hamamoto channel can be found. Right? These are not just one-offs, and they're not just random. They are connected, and these are all people that have been on my radar for many, many years, and now I have the opportunity, the luxury of really studying their own work closely. The two books that I talked about last time on Lathrop, Stanford, Jane are academic books written by people from the academic establishment. And in one of the books, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to revisit this, because I don't think it was fully recognized because of my error with the audio. By the way, I'm looking in the discussion. Is my audio working? I don't see any problems with, okay, yeah, I guess I'm coming through all right. And I can see here that I'm not muted. But it's because of the problem I have with the muted first version, which ironically had more views than the second version, because I immediately went back into the saddle and I redid it, and I think the second version was better. But the second version goes into more explicit detail in the fact that Jane Lathrop Stanford and Leland Stanford were engaged, and this is 1868. This isn't from an academic book. This is not from some conspiratainment site, right? This is from a guy who was on medical school faculty from Stanford University itself, all right? I bought the book, I filed it away, I showed it to you, but the point is that Leland, he was a railroad baron, right? Head of the Union Pacific Railroad that terminated here in Sacramento, that connected the Transcontinental Railroad. We all learned this in school in American history. That's Leland Stanford. When you talk about railroads, you're talking about J.P. Morgan. We're talking about J.P. Morgan. You're talking about Rothschild. That's Rothschild. And the railroad monopoly, they owned almost all of it, 99% of it. And Stanford was one of their boys. And with some of the money, they started the occult university. And I saw me saying, now this is their idea. They were going to start a university built on principles of spiritualism, talking to the dead, rapping. I told you in the latter part of the 19th century, as a product of the Second Great Awakening, that the upper middle class and the bourgeoisie, which are almost entirely white and almost entirely Protestant, were heavily involved in Spiritism, which is a euphemism for Luciferianism. I don't know if I stress that strongly enough. Luciferianism. And you know what that is, right? You know why Lucifer was cast out of heaven? Because he wanted to be as God. And isn't that what a lot of so-called neuroscience is doing? Because psychiatry has been pretty much discredited by any number of psychiatrists themselves, right? Like Dr. Thomas Szasz, Dr. Peter Bregan, who I think is still practicing psychiatry, and all kinds of people. Right? So it's, but we're going to rebrand it. We're going to call it neuroscience. And I'm telling this because I'm reading a lot of the literature that's promoting it. Maybe that's another talk. I've been reading extensively this week, alongside this material here. And it's germane because what did they try to do to Ezra Pound? They did incarcerate him for a dozen years. And they stigmatized him with that of being a nutcase and a fascist and an anti-Semite. Well, that's the hat trick right there. That's the trifecta. How are you ever going to dig yourself out of a hole like that? So this is the challenge today that I am going to undertake. Let's talk about Phoebe Hearst. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I have to apologize. There's one other tidbit I have to share with you about Phoebe Epperson Hearst. Remember I mentioned, go back if you don't remember, that she was a devotee of Abdul Baha. And she met him. She went to what was then Persia. It was the protectorate. It was under British control back then. This is all Anglo-American operation. We're talking about anything, right? Skull and Bones, University of California, Stanford, Rothschild, J.P. Morgan. She went to go visit this prophet named Abdul Baha, after which the religion, Baha'i religion, was named, which, as I told you before, is the fastest growing religion today. And when I started reading her connection with it, I already suspect, oh, this is a British intelligence operation, British slash Israeli. This is before the formation of the state of Rothschild, Israeli, right? That wasn't formed until later, right? But the British were getting set up to, the Rothschild, which means the British slash Rothschild, were getting set up their own synthetic state called Israel today, right? And you know all the mythology and the backstory of that Zionism and whatnot, political Zionism as well as religious Zionism. That's the nature, the quality of my viewership. They're not newbies. So she went there, and she even had him. He came on a tour of the U.S. to visit a lot of crazy old other very wealthy. They're white. I'm going to say they're white women's, because colored women's weren't involved with this. We're talking about a heavily racially segregated society. So I'm talking about crazy white women's. And I'm saying there's a lot of them running around in 2023. Now they're calling themselves ufologists or New Age or whatever, right? But you can't say that because you're a sexist and you're a racist if you do say that. But they are the lineal descendants of Jane Lathrop Stanford and Phoebe Apperson Hearst. They were totally into women's education, co-education, which I am for as well. I am for gender equality. If you haven't figured that out already. Gender, religious, ethnic equality. Equality as it's enshrined in the U.S. Bill of Rights, right? And they were right. Both these women supported women in higher education because they were menfolk. Many of them were trying to suppress it. And one of the innovations of what became Stanford University is that they, from the outset, wanted to admit women on an equal basis as men's. Right? So don't get it twisted now. When I go into this rhetoric to get you all riled up, because I do want to kind of mix it up here and get you excited so that you'll dig into it deeply. But let me just finish it up here. So I found out the connection, which I didn't know until I read her biography, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, that she was Baha'i. And then I was reading, just serendipitous, right? Just happenstance. This is what happens when you've experienced this. The eureka moment, the aha. You're reading something seemingly utterly different. I was reading some site. I'm not going to give you the name of the site or the person who authored the article because to me he's not fully credible in my eyes either. But even in those sites, there's some information there that's useful and it's worth checking out. But anyway, on this side of it, I was reading an entire article devoted to, am I ever going to get to Ezra Pound? I might have to save that for another talk. But there was an entire article devoted to Dr. Stephen Greer. Okay, he's a medical doctor. You know his story, and I mention this because everybody here in the chat room has seen him. He's the guy that wears the tight polo shirts, with the high cuffs here so he can show his guns, and he's an EMT guy. He can bench press 400 pounds. He can kick your ass. He's no wimpy, sort of living room ufologist. He's heading a disclosure movement. That's Stephen Greer, right? And if you've seen my earlier talks, I've gone through any number of these people's works and try to vet it on air for veracity, believability, factuality, and also trying to raise or examine the question of whether if it's a psyop or not, truth, diversion. And by the way, I have a posting on my Patreon. You can see that full link to the article that I mentioned, and you can read it with all the links within it. And you can also get an excerpt of the book that I was able to confirm from his own writing, Dr. Stephen Greer. It's called Hidden Truth Forbidden Knowledge, published in 2006. By the way, it's going used on Amazon for, I think, something like $100. A lot of these books are going away, but physical copies. They're going to Kindle so they can Kindle it later if it becomes inconvenient to have it around. So buy these books when you can, hard copies. All my favorite authors, Kirby Summers, Michael, his book's still in print, miraculously. People that I've talked about in an interview before, buy their books in hardcover if you can, because they're going to go away just like the paper. It's fake anyway. The paper currency is going away. But I'm not panicking about that, by the way. Maybe it's for the better that we go through this incredible economic crisis. This whole system is coming to an end, and the reason I'm mentioning is because guess who was talking about it and delineating the structure and the names involved with this banking system? It was Ezra Pound. See how it comes full circle again? Anyway, let me finish with Dr. Stephen Greer. As it turns out, this one site that was talking smack about him mentioned that he was Baha'i. I said, oh, that rings a bell. I was following Phoebe Hirsch on Baha'i. So I said, I'm not going to take his word. I'm going to look at Greer's book himself. And he talks about being in Israel, living in Israel for 2 or 3 years. And I think Baha'i is probably a Israeli intelligence front today. Maybe originally when Abdul Baha was alive, it was organic, right? But today, you know about Operation Chaos and cults and fake religions and friends. You know about Vatican, post-Vatican II, and this guy goes in on everybody. So he said he's behind. So I looked at his own book, and he talks about his whole adventure in Israel and visiting the gravesite of Abdul Baha and being Baha'i, which is the fastest growing religion today in 2023. So if nothing else, just keep that in the back of your mind. If you start hearing Baha'i, and if you start seeing them taking the place that was vacated by Scientology, which was another synthetic cult that a lot of celebs finally came out, and a lot of people aren't feeling very good about being attached to it. But so let's move over to Baha'i. There's Nixium and all this, and again, Kirby Summers had a really good series on that. There were these crazy ass women's behind Nixium. It wasn't Keith Raniere was a very smart con man, but the women who were doing all this was women's. Okay, in 2020, whatever, recently. Okay, and they had wealth, they had money, they had resources. I don't have it. You don't have it, whether you're a woman's or a man's. You don't have that wealth, you don't have that power to create these synthetic cults. So anyway, that's Dr. Stephen Greer. It's in his own words. I don't like to go on hearsay. I go into their own work, and now you can better evaluate, I think, the so-called disclosure movement, which I've always held in, not in high regard, but in a very skeptical fashion. And they're on all the show. I mean, it's just, like I said, it's become entertainment, it's distraction. And that I'm preaching to the choir. The people who are watching this and watch it later know this, but for some of the people who come in later and watch the show after it's in the can, so to speak, and they're pissed off because I'm criticizing, so-and-so and so, and their favorite person who's imprinted their personnel, they're going to be pissed off as hell, but they might be motivated to start reevaluating who these people that they hold up as heroes, and then we'll be better able to pursue the true miscreants behind the system. I think Ezra Pound and Eustace Mullins got it right for the most part. With the knowledge, the information that they had at their disposal, they got it right for the most part. Right? The particulars might differ, and I say that because there's all these nitpickers. Oh, well, he got this wrong, so the whole framework's been discredited, right? Those are your nitpickers. But overall, Pound figured it out. Okay, so finally, we're going to get into it. I was able to acquire this book thanks to my Patreon supporters. And for those, in fact, what I should have been just name checking Ezra Pound without really explaining who he is, but I'm going to let one of these biographies do some of the explaining, or splaining, as Ricky Ricardo used to do. You've got a lot of splaining to do, Lucy. Right? So I'm going to let the two of you do some splaining, even though I'll probably, hopefully I don't get a copyright strike. I'm going to show a little bit of it. Ezra Pound, you check it out on your own. There's tons of material out there. I encourage you to read it. You'll find him fascinating. I think he's, for any people who have access to capital, want to make money, make a feature film on Ezra Pound. All the post-millennials, all the hipsters, all the cool people who want to be poets and musicians and spoken word artists, and you're alternative, or you want to be, you're at the Rhode Island School of Design, or you're in the art department, or you're in performance studies. Check out Ezra Pound. He's the next big thing. Professor Hamamoto's predicting there's going to be a huge Ezra Pound revival, so get on top of it. I mean, look at his pick. He looks like he's something like right out of 2023 avant-garde. Yeah.
As a poet, translator, critic, and essayist, Ezra Pound exerted a profound influence on English literature in the 20th century. A voracious reader, his work teems with allusions and references to authors who captured his attention. Because of his political activities and socio-economic theories, Pound still generates controversy. In both his own work and through advancing the work of others he admired, Pound represents a seminal moment in defining the modernist aesthetic. With such a vast and eclectic legacy, Ezra Pound is a literary figure who defies easy classification. He received a scholarship to carry out research in Spain on the playwright Lope de Vega.